It's a great pleasure being with you this morning. I'm Professor Yossi Shain. I'm the head of the School of Political Science, Government and International Affairs at Tel Aviv University. And I'm a professor of government and diaspora politics at Georgetown University. In fact, I took an emeritus status lately. I've been writing on the subject of Israel and on international affairs and diaspora affairs. My latest book is The Israeli Century and the Israelization of Judaism, which I'm glad to say became a big bestseller in Israel. It deals with the subject of what happened to the Jews when sovereignty is the most important component that informs their lives in all aspects, from theology to politics to sociology. The very fact that the majority of the Jewish people will reside in the state of Israel soon. We are now 14 million Jews around the world, more or less, and almost 7 million already in Israel. And by all trajectories, Israel will comprise the majority of the Jewish people. And of course, Israel is dictating much of what's happening in the Jewish world for good or ill. So this is one of the subjects in my book, The Israeli Century and the Israelization of Judaism. This morning, I was asked by the beautiful people of Project Interchange to talk to you more about the Palestinian issue, especially since the Oslo Accords. I don't want to get into lots of history, which I understand you are getting from other classes. I just want to say one thing, that one has to make a distinction between the Jewish-Israeli-Arab conflict and the Jewish-Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The first one is, of course, the product of a long history of the Jews settling in Palestine and the Zionist movement, what we call the 48 problem, 1948, where in fact, the question was of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the lack of validity to the Jewish state in Israel, the new modern Jewish state. The second, of course, is the second issue of 1967, after Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights and the Sinai Desert at the time, where the issue of the Palestinians came to the fore because Palestinians were now under Israeli occupation. Of course, one remembers that many Palestinians remain in Israel after 1948, after the creation of the state, and they became Israeli Arabs. Initially, they were Israeli Arabs that lived under emergency laws, but gradually became full-fledged citizens and now comprise 15 seats in the parliament with 2 million strong Arabs who consider themselves Israelis first and foremost, which is remarkable, even though they are Israeli Palestinians, but they are Israelis. And there are lots of questions to what extent they can be part of the state, full citizens, because the state is a Jewish state, while they are citizens who are Arabs. And of course, there are the Palestinians who are either in the West Bank, what my people call the occupied territories, or as refugees. So what we get today, this morning, is about the Israeli-Arab-Palestinian conflict. And I just want to say one word. Since 1978, when Israel had a peace deal with Egypt, and this was a very important moment in Israeli-Arab relations, because it's the first time that an Arab state signed a peace deal with Israel. Since the peace deal between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, the Palestinian conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli issue became even more pronounced because more and more Arabs came to deal with Israel. It will be more of even so after the Oslo Agreement, which was signed in 1993. Prior to the Oslo Agreement, the Palestinian issue gained tremendous, I would say, attention in world affairs for a variety of reasons. In the 70s, it was the Palestinian Liberation Organization related to all acts of terrorism, all the terrorism of the left in the 1980s. Later on, of course, the Palestinians became completely, I would say, involved in third world affairs, and they became the poster children of third world affairs. In the 1980s, when the Soviet Union was already on its leg out, the Palestinians in the end of 1987 began their intifada, the first uprising, to claim the right for self-determination. This was at the time when the United States was gradually becoming the hegemon in world affairs. Hegemon in the sense that the Soviet Union will decline after the Gulf War of 1990-1991. In 1990, 1991, when the Gulf War erupted and America eventually invaded Iraq, the Palestinian issue came to the fore as a side story. But many people thought if we can only resolve the Palestinian issue vis-a-vis Israel, we can also gain access to the Arab world. This was part of the logic that was leading to the Oslo Accord. Prior to that, there was the Madrid Accord in 1991, an accord that came on the hill of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the victory of America in the first Gulf War in 1991. So one must understand that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was always part and parcel of the international system altogether. Coming to Oslo, therefore, was a moment in history. Remember, it was after Clinton came to the White House in 1993, in January 1993, and eventually the Rabin government was elected, and the Madrid conference took place. The people wanted the Palestinians to be represented. European state gave the Palestinians all the support. So Israel agreed, and sometimes reluctantly so, of course, to negotiate with Palestinians, and the Palestinians came to the fore with Yasser Arafat to say, we are terminating hostilities of the past 100 years at the time. It was such a drama in international affairs that Arafat came to the South Lawn with Mr. Shimon Peres and the late Prime Minister Rabin to shake hands and to pledge that they will resolve all issues without bloodshed. This was such a dramatic event. People thought that the Middle East will be now almost like Europe, open boundaries, that all wars are out. It was again on the hill of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the vision that American supremacy will lead all of us into a liberal world order with transnationalism, with the issue of globalization taking more and more center stage, and NAFTA agreement was in place, and all of this kind of transnationalism became part of the notion that we can reach an agreement also in the Middle East, and the idea of Palestinian statehood was only a matter of time. The Oslo Agreement therefore opened up hopes not only in the Middle East, but in the entire world, in terms of if this conflict can be resolved, all other things can be resolved as well. But the Oslo Agreement from the beginning was very problematic. To begin with, the aspiration of the Palestinians to recover all the land of Israel never ended, never ended. It was for Arafat only a stage before the next stage will take place. Secondly, it was unclear whether the Palestinians will have autonomy initially in part of the Gaza, of Gaza and the West Bank, and what is the end result of the Oslo Agreement, because it was supposed to be incremental shifts. In Israel also, there was a tremendous opposition to the idea of a future Palestinian state amidst the Israeli state in terms of the West Bank, returning the West Bank because of settlements, because of the right-wing position that one should not be able to trust the Arabs if they will have a foothold in the land of Israel itself. So from the first step, the agreement was a murky one, with disbelief on all sides, and especially with Arafat always playing the role, speaking in Arabic and in English, as Bill Clinton puts it in his book, in terms of, like, on the one hand, moving forward, on the other hand, the struggle of the Palestinians never ended. And the struggle for the Palestinians, he meant the struggle for the recovery of the entire land of Palestine lost in the war of 1948. So you have to understand, the Oslo Agreement was about the land conquered in 1967. The Palestinian rhetoric always remained about the question of 1948, not only of refugees, but for them, the very existence of the state of Israel was perceived as untenable, notwithstanding at that time the diplomatic maneuvering. People got the Nobel Peace Award and so on, and we moved, and Israel brought Palestinians from the places of exile where Israel fought against them, and brought Arafat into Gaza and Jericho. This was the first step after the Oslo Agreement, which was signed on September 13, 1993 in the United States. Very quickly after that, of course, the jewel on the crown of the Palestinian-Israeli deal was that Israel signed another deal with the Jordanians. The Jordanians were always a key feature of the Israeli-Arab-Palestinian conflict, because Jordan is a state whose majority of population are Palestinians by origin, and the kingdom was very much involved from day one on the issue of what will happen in the Middle East. The kingdom of King Hussein at the time, and before that, grandfather Abdullah, was trying to live side by side with Israel, but always with the understanding that it has a degree of superficiality, because the majority of the citizens are Palestinians, many of whom fled in 1948. If I speak too fast, it's because I want to include lots of evidence before I move forward. But of course, if you will have questions later on, I'll be delighted to get them. So we began in 1993 with the peace agreement, which led to the agreement also with the Jordanians. The Jordanian agreement should supplement the Palestinian agreement, because that meant that Jordan itself gave up on the territory of the West Bank. Keep in mind that the West Bank was never conquered from the Palestinians. It was conquered in the 1967 war from Jordan. It was a state-owned Jordanian land after they conquered it in 1948. The Palestinians were never part of this deal in the international system because they refused to have a state in 1948. So what began as an Arab-Israeli conflict became all the way an Israeli-Palestinian conflict when Jordan gave up on its claims to have the West Bank, which was part and parcel of the Jordanian state until 1967. The Palestinian issue was heightened by a tremendous shift in world affairs. Not only shifts toward liberalism, openness, and democratization, but also shifts in the Arab world and rebelliousness in the Arab world, including, of course, the challenge which was posed since already the 70s by the Iranian regime, which started to foment the religious revolution in the Middle East. The religious revolution, the Islamization of the Middle East, was a very important factor which will impact Israeli-Palestinian relation. On the one hand, the religious component came to challenge nationalist regime, above all, of course, Egypt. When Anwar Sadat signed the accord of the peace accord with Israel in the late 70s, early 1980, he was assassinated in 81 by Islamic Brotherhood, by religious people who said, you cannot sign a deal with Israel. You are betraying the Arab cause. Arab regime were always leery about the Islamists, but they had to pay tribute. And with Iranians fomenting the radicalization of the Middle East, more and more Arab Islamists came to the fore in the early 1990s, while simultaneously the idea of the global state, the idea of the world as an open space, the idea of the end of history, so to speak, which was coined by Fukuyama, was also reigning supreme. This was the dilemma that we had two poles pushing. One is a modernized pole, the other is Islamists. Yasser Arafat, for example, always played the two, and the Palestinians became bifurcated society because of Islamists and modernists in their midst. And that's a very important factor. This will impact tremendously the Oslo Accord, because on the one hand, Israel signed with the Palestinians. On the same time, the objection to the accord, both in Israel from the right wing and among the Islamists, among the Palestinians, grew violently. And that will come to explode still very shortly after the accord, with suicide bombings inside Israel that killing people, and many people protested. How can Rabin continue in dealing with the Palestinians, murderous sort of killing, while at the same time talking about peace in the region? This will be the tension that will inform the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for the next decade, from the early 1993 or the September 93, all the way to, let's say, the early 2000. And we will explain that. During that period, Israeli governments, not only Rabin, who was assassinated because of Oslo in 1995, but also Bibi Netanyahu, who came after him, who was very reluctant about the deal with the Palestinians, but he also continued to deal with Yasser Arafat amidst violence. And Bibi Netanyahu, who was dealing with Arafat about the deal,
and he was the one who signed the Hebron deal, giving Hebron to the Palestinians, was basically remained committed to the Oslo agreement. But he was kind of like moving slowly. So what we had Palestinian terrorism starting to take shape in the mid-1990s after the assassination of Rabin. The Israeli left is yearning for more, kind of like moving forward. The Israeli right pushing back. Bibi is dealing with Arafat, but Arafat is also kind of reluctant in his own way, and Bibi is reluctant. And this was also in the midst of the international posture in world affairs that is pushing the two sides to get into a deal. This is into the at the time of the late 90s. It was at this time, in fact, that we see that the thesis of the globalization of the world, represented by the idea of the deal between Israel and Palestinians, was also bringing the clash of civilizations. Two books which were written at the time, one by Samuel Huntington, which was The Clash of Civilization, the other by Thomas Friedman, The Lexus and the Olive Tree. Thomas Friedman was representing the globalization. Huntington was putting the sign that it's a clash of civilization and is imminent. And indeed, the United States itself had to contend, the Clinton administration, with the rise of Islamists while moving ahead with globalists. And the conflict in Israel was a political conflict between the right and the left. Netanyahu coming to power in 1996, he is on the one hand reluctant to move with the Palestinians, but has to be committed to it. And the Palestinians themselves were playing always a double game, because whatever they will get will not be enough, because in their vision, this deal doesn't give them much. We were planning on a much larger state, and Arafat playing the two sides became a very important factor into the late 1990s. In the late 1990s, something is happening. Netanyahu is losing the election to Ehud Barak in May of 1999, in a sweeping victory for Barak, which was supposed to bring the Oslo Accord back on track. This will lead to this dramatic deal, which was supposed to be a final arrangement between Israel and Palestinians, which will be dealt with the Clinton administration in his last few months in office. In his last few months in office, with Bill Clinton running the show and Dennis Ross and others, they're trying to bring a final arrangement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The Palestinian Israelis where the Israel is giving back on 97% of the land, and Arafat, and you remember all the pictures in Camp David, back and forth, until the whole thing is exploding suddenly. Exploding because Arafat would not be willing to accept a state which was less than what he had envisioned, if he ever would have had any state. Barak was also packing, and everybody was gearing toward kind of like a critical moment. To the last moment of the Clinton administration, even interim rule between Clinton and the George Bush son coming to office after the rocky election that America had, the Palestinian issue was capturing the minds and hearts of many people, from the point that perhaps we're arriving in a final arrangement, or we will be drifted into the abyss of conflict. Indeed, I can tell you a story, a personal story. I was teaching at Georgetown at the time when events already started to blow up. And Shimon Peres came to visit Georgetown and met with my student. And he was still saying that things are inevitable, that we will lead into an arrangement and a peace deal, because this is the kind of like the end of history. But then, yet again, things did not unfold as planned. In fact, the second intifada, the eruption of the Palestinians, which began in October 2000 and became into a very violent intifada with suicide bombing all over, captured sort of like the entire Middle East. The whole idea of an arrangement went into flames with enmity and death, much more than ever before, which brings down the entire vision of a peace deal with the Palestinians, and also bring down the Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who after a year and a half in office, that's all, was crushed by the political system, disbelief that something will happen, and the whole era of the peace accord of 1993 came to an end almost in a crushing business. This will be the second intifada, and the huge wave of suicide bombing will more or less will take shape also in terms of the vision of what is happening, in line also of what was happening in the United States soon thereafter, September 11. September 11 and the Islamization of world affairs brought the clash of civilization over the thesis of the end of history. Instead of end of history and globalization, we ended up in a huge war on terror. America was attacked, and America was trying to understand what is happening. Initially, it was the Bush administration who thought, and Colin Powell, that maybe if we'll solve the Palestinian issue, the Arabs or the Muslims will not hate America. But this, of course, did not work. And even President Bush discovered when Ariel Sharon was already the prime minister that Arafat was bringing ships with weapons, and Bush himself disconnected from Arafat. So there was a very rapid deterioration in the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Palestinians went into a war with Israel. It was a terrorist war here and there. And all of this became engulfed in the Islamist revolutions that took place. The Islamist revolution of the 1990s, and on the hill of the Second Gulf War, and the American involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan with Al-Qaeda. So from time to time, they used to drop the Palestinian issue as an explanation for global terrorism. It was always the case. The Palestinian issue was kind of an explanation for global terrorism. And this was informing the early 1990s all the way because of the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And the two seemed at the time connected in the minds of some. Not necessarily were connected in fact, but nevertheless, the language was connected. The ethos of this Islamization of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was connected. This is also the time that the Hamas movement, the religious Islamist movement, which grew as part of the Palestinian resistance already in the 80s, became much more pronounced. They were already pronounced in the 1980s and 1990s, the Hamas, as a wing among the Palestinians, but it became even more pronounced when the Hamas leadership, in fact, took over Gaza and basically brought down the regime of post-Arafat era. Arafat era, in fact, came to an end in some ways when Ariel Sharon attacked the Palestinians as a result of the Second Intifada. And Arafat himself died in a very peculiar manner out of poisonous, whatever it is, doesn't matter. And Mahmoud Abbas, his second in command, took over. Mahmoud Abbas, who is until now the president of the Palestinians. So the Palestinian issue became completely subsumed also in an internal rivalry between Hamas and the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PA, the Palestinian Administration. And in a semi-civil war between these two wings, Gaza was taken over by Hamas. So the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, took two shapes. On the one hand, dealing with Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank, but also fighting a huge nemesis in Gaza, Islamist group of Hamas, which was tied to other radical Islamists in the region, above all, of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Iranian regime of course, away from here. All of this is evolving while the political crisis in America is also taking shape. The world affairs is taking a different path. Democratization and globalization is giving way to the war against terrorism. The ethos of democracy is suffering. By 2008, when we see the Freedom House reporting that democracy is starting a steep decline, we see that the Arab-Israeli conflict is not taking center stage in the world, but it's part and parcel of what is happening. It will wait until Mr. Obama, President Obama, will come to the White House. The thing will start to unfold in a different direction. That's what it seemed. At that time, when Obama came to the White, after the collapse of the economy and Obama majestic kind of victory for the 2008 elections, Obama came to the region, the Middle East, with a promise that we will bring the Middle East to a new stage. We'll also bring a recovery between the West and Islam. Remember the very famous talk that Obama gave, it's what's known as the Cairo speech that he gave in the University of Cairo at the time. This will lead to some new hopes in the Middle East because on the one hand, the Arabs thought this is our time for democracy. And indeed, this will lead to what we call the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, which began in 2011 with people in the streets wanting democracy, human rights, etc., giving hope against perhaps all hopes that we will open all the Arab dictatorial regime while the Palestinians themselves will leave into independence and so on. At that time, the Obama administration pushed Netanyahu government very harshly. Prior to that, the Olmert government, which collapsed amidst a corruption scandal, was already dealing with the Palestinians, offering the Palestinians 99% of the territory, including in East Jerusalem, but Mahmoud Abbas refused. So when Netanyahu came back to power in 2009, he comes with the Obama administration suggesting that now we will have to move and he has to freeze settlements, and the Arab Spring of democratization will force shifts in the Middle East because Mubarak will lose Egypt. The forces of democratization will require that things will happen to the Palestinians as well because they still held to the ethos of democracy, notwithstanding the fact that at least half of them were Hamas-oriented Islamists against all visions of democracy and human rights. The next stage, of course, will be that the Arab Spring, which began as a huge promise, will lead us into the abyss of the rise of the harshest Islamic manifestation. In Egypt, of course, it was before that the Arab Muslim Brotherhood took place in a democratic election until Sisi got involved. In Syria, a mayhem of civil war of incredible proportion. In Iraq and in Yemen and all over the Middle East, what we have witnessed a calamity of Islamic radicalism leading into the Islamic State and the butchering of innocent people. The very idea of a state of Palestinian in Israel became more and more remote in their minds and hearts, let alone in the vision that democracy and liberalism will run supreme over the Islamist threats. The Islamist threat became so imminent. It took lots of time until the West will adjust to this reality. The Obama administration, of course, the whole issue of Libya, what happened is this debacle in foreign policy that took place because of the Arab Spring collapsing into the Islamic revolution that brought Arabs back rather than bring them forward. This is the time when Hamas is gaining momentum, Hezbollah is gaining momentum, Iranians are becoming more and more important, and the nuclear threat in Israel is taking a center stage. Palestinian issue is taking a back seat. In fact, since in the last decade, the Palestinian issue took a back seat, many people started to see that the Arab-Israeli conflict is not what informing the Middle East, but rather internal Arab rivalries between Sunnis and Shiites, between factions, between states that lost their boundaries, between issues pertaining to internal rivalries of dictators and people holding power. And it's not only the Arab-Israeli conflict. This legacy and efficacy of the Palestinians declining was so severe for the Palestinians that the interest in them started to become lower and lower. While Trump being elected, he's completely shifting the rhetoric. The Palestinians are no longer as the head of the discussion as in the Obama administration. To the last minute, the Obama administration was trying to do something with the Palestinians, but of course to no avail. So the Trump changed the cards. He became friendly with Arab regime, Sunni regime against the Iranians. Arab government became completely distant with the Palestinians. And the Israeli government also made the point that the Palestinian issue is no longer its issue. Regardless of the fact that Netanyahu, after Obama came to power, made a very famous speech known as the two-state solution, the Bar Ilan speech, So he withdrew from the speech, not committing anymore to the Palestinian state. All of this leading us to the Trump administration, which basically did make the mistake that others make on this issue, didn't embroil himself in the Palestinian-Israeli rivalry. Understood that this is a very tricky business because every American administration that wanted to solve the Israel-Palestinian conflict felt the burn. The Obama administration, of course, the Clinton administration all the way, the Carter administration, anyone wanted to deal with it was very much the Bush administration, et cetera, et cetera. So where we are is that the fact that the efficacy of the Palestinian has declined. At the same time, there is kind of like a permanent war on the Gaza Strip, which variation of intensity. The Palestinians, the West Bank were prospering during this year, while all the Arabs were kind of suffering because of the calamity of the Arab Spring. So many people thought the two-state solution is no longer viable, let alone because Israel was not committed to them anymore. And of course, before Trump announced his 100-year plan, 100-year sort of like revolutionary plan, it was not even discussed. When Trump presented this plan a few months ago and suggesting that Israel, at the same time, Trump already recognized Jerusalem, the Golan, suggesting, and the Golan Heights, when Trump suggested that Israel the Palestinians can have only 70% of the West Bank and not 1990, of course the Palestinians say no, and Israel is intending on annexing the West Bank. So where we are is that this issue is very much not in the minds and hearts of the people, not in Europe, not anywhere. The legacy somewhat changed, even though attacks on Israel and this delegitimation continue. But the big question is whether we can put an end to this problem. Can Israel and the Palestinians become one state? Or will Israel annex? What will happen if the Palestinians will not be Israeli citizens? What will happen to Hamas? All these are outstanding issues, which are now seem dormant. They seem that it's not so intense as it used to be. Of course, the legacy of the 1990s disappeared. The legacy of democracy. Israel grew economically and otherwise, while the Arabs went back. Will it erupt again? And in what fashion it will erupt? All of these are important questions that will be discussed because right now, with President Trump and his plan, the only plan on the table, will we move forward? As we're now forming, hopefully, a government in Israel this next week, after torturous year and a half without the government, with all kind of scandals, etc., the big question will be whether the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will take a new twist, whether it will be remaining sort of like on a low burner with Israel and Hamas fighting in Gaza, some degree of cooperation with the West Bank, and a moment of explosion awaiting us, or whether we will arrange a certain degree of new life together. All of this is really in the making, while Israeli Arabs themselves, the citizens, are also moving more and more away from the Palestinians because they have their own issue in the state of Israel. So what I gave you, ladies and gentlemen, is kind of a quick wrap up of all of this. There's so much more details in this business, and one can dig here and dig there. But I think you can see that what seemed so much inevitable in the 1990s is no longer inevitable now. Even if it's possible now, it's questionable because the last 30 years have seen so many turns and changes that one cannot imagine how we can really think in previous terms. Anytime we try to impose previous kind of like thinking on the condition now, we are failing. Many diplomats have failed. I once said to Dennis Ross, my friend, he talked about the mythology of the Palestinians and mythology of the Israelis. And I told him, Dennis, the only mythology you don't talk about is the mythology of the American diplomat who can solve issue. It's not for the American to solve, it's for us to solve. And I'm not sure we can do so into the future. How much it will explode in our face or whether we'll resolve it one way or another, yet to be seen. So I'm thanking you for your attention. And I hope you got something out of my, wow, quick lecture without even drinking a cup of water. Thank you.